Before the Battle of Hoover Dam, before even the forming of Caesar's Legion, two men had a vision for a new world created with blood and glory. One flag, one purpose. Tribes united under a blood-red sun, who knew the horror they would inflict, who knew the true cost of peace in a land of endless war.
These people are going to kill us.
It's looking increasingly likely.
Joshua Graham and Edward Sallow looked down into the valley. They'd been captives of the Blackfoot since they had hiked into the Grand Canyon weeks before. Now, their time was up. The desert wind sent gusts into the valley beneath them, and deep below they could just make out the shape carved into the cliff face. A vault. Blackfoot warriors surrounded Edward and Joshua on all sides. Their companion, Bill Calhoun, was back at the Blackfoot camp, seeing to a group of Blackfoot children that had come down with a skin disease. Unlike Joshua and Edward, Bill was useful. Joshua and Edward were two more mouths to feed. No one was going to pay their ransom, and why should they? How many other interlopers had come out here only to die in the desert with the rest of the critters?
Are you sure there are guns in that vault?
That's what the manifest said.
And if they're wrong?
Edward didn't respond. He kept looking down into the valley and back at their captors. They were gaunt and ragged. Their weapons were poorly maintained and ramshod. Their chieftain, a tall man with a mask covered with cactus flowers and bright yellow paint, wheezed in between wet gasps. The chieftain pointed down into the valley and nodded. Another warrior pushed the two men down a steep trail. They switchbacked down into the valley. As the group moved down toward the vault, the sun followed them, casting long shadows and warm orange light between the rocky outcrops. Joshua was counting the amount of men around them in his head, wondering if they could outrun them. He could, but not Edward. Edward was smart, but slow. And even if he did make it to safety, they'd torture Edward to death in response to Joshua's escape. Such was the way of things in this desolate place. The vault door was coming into view now, and the group stopped just outside its huge looming visage. Edward turned toward Joshua and sneered.
Tell them that when we come out of here, we will give them the power to destroy their enemies, that they will be the most powerful of the Arizona 8. No one will stand in their way. More land, more slaves, more sky.
Joshua dutifully translated this into the Blackfoot tongue, and the chieftain laughed in his gruesome, wet-sounding way. When he stopped laughing, he spoke to Joshua a while and laughed again. The wet, sickly sound hissing out from behind his bizarre mask.
What did he say?
He said that if we return to them with nothing, they're going to take our eyes and then lock us back inside the vault for eternity. Then we'd truly understand what it is to be blind men searching for answers in the dark.
Edward smiled a cruel smile. He looked the chieftain dead in the eye. Edward looked like he was whispering something under his breath, but Joshua couldn't make it out. He just kept smiling that cruel, hateful smile. And with that, the two men began to walk into the mouth of the vault. They had no food, no weapons, and enough water for a day, if that. Greater legends have been birthed with less. Joshua and Edward slowly walked into the entryway of the vault. There was a large welcoming area enclosed with railings and covered in age-old dust. Edward couldn't help but notice the piles of bones scattered around the dirt-choked floor. In the center of the space was a console, connected to a huge cog-shaped door. Edward dug in his robes and pulled out a patchwork of circuits and cabling.
It's a vault key. I broke apart one of those stupid Pip-Boy things. This is probably the only worthwhile part of it.
Joshua nodded wordlessly, and Edward got to work connecting the cables to the console.
Will there be any power?
Not through most of the vault, but there should be enough reserve juice in the emergency systems.
A loud buzzer sounded, followed by flashing lights through the entryway. There was a tremendous cranking and groan as the vault doors begun to lift. As the doors hit the ceiling of the vault, a gust of putrid air blew over Joshua and Edward, causing both of them to cover their mouths.
God, did you smell that?
Yes, it stunk like rotting corpses.
Edward and Joshua shared a final look before crossing the threshold and entering the vault proper. Neither of them looked behind them, as going backward was as much a death sentence as going forward. The first thing they could see was the smashed glass windows of what remained of the security booth. Something or someone has smashed their way through the place, and large pieces of jagged glass littered the vault floor. Everywhere was the copper tang of dried blood, and black smears of it could be seen over everything.
This is old blood.
Edward sniffed the air and moved closer into the security booth. He stopped and his eyes grew. Joshua followed them. Sitting on the floor of the booth was half a man. Well, half a ghoul. The wretched thing's legs were strips of dried flesh, the femur and tibia bones long gone.
Good God.
The ghoul looked up with black eyes at them, and the corners of its mouth turned.
Either of you got a cigarette?
Both men reared back.
I'd go to the store, but, well, you know.
The ghoul motioned with a leathery hand at what remained of his legs.
How did you survive?
Bad luck, bad timing, and a pack of ferals who get bored easily. Name's Hatchet.
I didn't ask your name.
Joshua shot Edward an exhausted look. The ghoul smiled and shrugged.
My name is Joshua. This is Edward. You know much about this vault?
The ghoul shifted on the floor of the booth and sighed.
Sure do. I've lived here for years, found the place way back. Lived here with the ferals all that time, but...
The ghoul's eyes got a faraway look for a moment.
Something changed in them, made them turn, even on me. Wasted my legs, my spine is shot too. To this day, I can't figure it out. Do you know the damnedest thing about it?
Edward was impatient.
What?
Hatchet motioned to a pile of junk to his side. It contained odds and ends from around the vault. Stacked on top of it all was a teddy bear, one of its black button eyes missing.
They keep bringing me gifts. Like to say sorry?
Hatchet shook his head and laughed low in his throat.
What about the vault? Is there a stockpile of guns here?
Yes and no. This used to be a National Guard outpost, way before everything fell apart. There was 3 inner vaults full of guns. 2 of them are empty now, and the third, well, you're not gonna like this part.
Joshua and Edward shared a hesitant look. Hatchet continued.
The only inner vault worth a damn is off the main atrium, right where the majority of the ferals live, if you call it that.
What's inside it?
Same thing as was in the others. Boxes and boxes of R91 assault rifles, ammo and more grenades that you'll ever need. But even if you clear the ferals, you'll need to open it. I can help with that.
How?
Hatchet shifted as best as he could and pulled up a key card. Edward went to reach for it.
Not so fast. We gotta make a deal.
Even though he couldn't hear it, Joshua imagined the sound Edward's teeth must have been making as they ground in his jaw.
What do you want?
I want you to kill every last feral here. Give 'em peace, and then kill me.
Edward smirked. Joshua's voice softened.
Are you sure?
Look at me. I can't do it myself. Long ago, I was a praying man. Some part of that still exists. You gotta do it. Agree, and I'll give you the key.
Joshua nodded.
I'll do it. You have my word.
Hatchet reached up a wretched hand and Joshua shook it whilst Edward watched on.
Right. Well, let's get you on your way.
Edward and Joshua moved as quietly as they could down the dim hallways of the vault. Every sound felt like an avalanche in that hollow metal tomb. The emergency lighting cast long shadows over the prefabricated walls, and whatever signage that was still legible was caked with dust and grime. They had traveled for a while until they found what Hatchet had told them to seek, a small section of personal quarters furthest away from where the majority of the feral ghouls would be.
This must be it.
Edward counted the rooms silently from left to right, stopping at the third.
Here.
They stepped into the quarters. What remained was destroyed or trashed. The remnants of a bed, splintered in the corner of the room. Paintings and personal affects were streaked with ancient blood and strewn about. Edward began to clear away the smashed bed, and then he smiled. He reached into his robes and removed Hatchet's keycard. Under the debris of the bed was a small floor vault. The keycard opened the electronic lock with a clack, and Edward began to remove the vault's contents. Joshua leaned forward and picked up one of the pistols. It was a .45 ACP automatic. He smiled.
This will work.
Edward and Joshua snuck along an upper atrium walkway, being careful to not make a noise. As they got closer, the sound of the ferals became louder. Edward nodded down below and they stopped. From their vantage point, they could see the two opened inner vaults, and right next to that, the closed vault full of guns. Only a few feet from that was a whole host of feral ghouls. They milled around a huge pile of decomposing corpses. Human beings, animals, and the remains of huge two-head Brahmin littered the vault floor. The stench was incredible. Edward motioned to Joshua to get closer, and he nodded in agreement. They were now at the railing directly over the ferals. As they got closer, they couldn't help but notice the red hue in the feral's skin. It was as if they were exposed to some kind of toxic or chemical. Some of the ferals stiffened and sniffed at the air, and Joshua and Edward froze, hoping the stench of their rotting corpses would mask their scent in that place. After a few moments, the group settled and continued to either sleep, eat, or fight amongst themselves. Edward led Joshua away from the railing, back into a nearby stairwell where they could speak.
What are your thoughts?
I can lead them away, if you can open the vault.
Then what?
You open anything you find, and God willing, I circle back to you. We then fight for our lives.
Later, Joshua silently made his way down the stairwell, close to where the majority of the ferals were. He had one of the 45s in hand as he descended. Rounding the corner of the floor of the atrium, he stopped. He realized there was even more of them than they had originally thought. He said a silent prayer and pointed the pistol at the closest feral and blew its head apart. Chaos. Joshua turned and ran deeper into the vault, and the vault exploded behind him with horrific croaks and howls as the ferals came after him. Nearby, Edward was climbing down from the walkway and inching toward the locked vault. He, too, had one of the pistols, but he knew he wouldn't be much of a shot when the time came. He swiped the security console alongside the vault door with Hatchet's keycard and held his breath. Joshua had nearly led the horde all the way back to the security entrance, and he could feel his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Just as he nearly hit the section with the security booth, he banked hard left and started to bring them back toward the atrium. There was a grinding, clanking sound, and the small inner vault door started to open. Edward smiled, but his smile turned to a look of terror as a lone feral lunged at him from within the vault. Edward cried out, stood back, and shot the thing in the head at point-blank range. Joshua was running on empty as he led them back to the upper floor of the atrium. He had one shot at this. Tucking the pistol into his belt, he leapt onto the walkway railing and began to climb to the atrium floor below. He could hear the bodies of the ferals as they leapt over him, smashing into the vault floor.
Get inside, now!
Joshua had made it to the atrium floor, and he raced under the smaller vault door as Edward began to close it from inside. But ferals didn't die coming over the railings, were now screeching as they closed in on the slowly shutting door. Edward and Joshua began to fire their pistols, dropping ferals as they closed in. Finally, the door shut with a deep, sickening thud. Joshua's breathing was heavy.
Well, that wasn't too bad.
Even Edward couldn't resist a relieved smile in the dim light of the vault. Outside the vault door, the remaining ferals howled and scratched at the steel between them and Joshua and Edward. From time to time, one of them would throw themselves against it, hammering so hard bones would break. Joshua and Edward listened and began to plan. It was just as Hatchet had said. What remained in this small storage vault were boxes and boxes of ammo, rifles, and grenades. Joshua began to break open the boxes, working the bolts on each rifle and throwing any that didn't work into a pile on the floor. He carefully opened the boxes of grenades and placed them at the back of the small vault, as far from anything as possible. Finally, he opened up the boxes of ammunition and began to load rifle magazines. The majority of them worked, a miracle amongst miracles.
How are we looking?
Good. Really good. The majority of the rifles and their ammunition seem to look okay, as do the grenades. However, we won't know for sure until we open that vault door.
Edward took a strip of cloth from the dead feral and wrapped it around his head, making a stinking makeshift set of earmuffs. Joshua did the same. They then each took turns firing a single round into the corpse of the feral. Each and every time, the rifles fired. An hour later, they had an assortment of loaded rifles at the ready along a barricade of ammo boxes. To each of their sides, loaded magazines sat at the ready. Still, the ferals screamed and clawed at the door of the vault, hurling themselves against it until they could no longer move. And even then, another would take up its turn, bashing its rotting body against the steel.
We open the door with them this riled up, and it won't matter how much ammo we have.
Joshua could see Edward grimace in the dim light of the vault. He sighed and began to rummage in a small pack they had brought with them. He threw Joshua a sack of piñon nuts.
Then we wait.
Joshua nodded and began to eat, sitting back along a stack of rifle boxes. Edward sat as well, drinking from an old water pouch.
When we get out of here, there has to be a better way. I've finished with following, finished with digging through the ashes and reflecting. It's time for something new.
Joshua chewed a handful of nuts.
Like what?
One flag, one purpose, and no more squabbling tribes, no more greedy plutocrats. A new legion for a new age.
Joshua smiled. He liked the idea.
How?
Edward motioned to the rifles.
You're looking at the start of it, tribe by tribe, village by village.
It takes a lot of resolve to change the world. My savior knew that. I know that.
We'll have to do things and make decisions neither of us have ever dreamed of. Decisions that your savior will never forgive you for, but he would understand.
There is a way which seems right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Proverbs 14:12.
Now Edward was nodding. Joshua studied the ceiling of the small vault they were trapped in.
I've seen a great deal of this part of the world and always wanted things to be better. Always wished that peaceful people could live in peace. But each and every time I've been proven wrong. Cruelty always comes home.
It doesn't have to be that way forever. No more chaos. No more peaceful people living in fear. One flag, one legion. And every person who lives under that flag will finally be home.
Joshua thought on what Edward said for a long time. Finally, he reached out his hand.
I'm with you.
Edward took Joshua's hand and shook it. For the next few hours they waited, and over time, the ferals began to tire. Finally, the thumping stopped altogether, and the men used this time to fitfully sleep. If either of them dreamed, we'll never know. Edward awoke when Joshua gently shook him.
It's time.
Joshua and Edward checked and double-checked the rifles, making sure even the pistols were ready if it came to that. In the rush to secure the vault, they could never be sure just how many ferals were on the side of that door. They had loaded rifles ready along their ammo box barricade, and they were planning to cut the ferals down, as if they were firing muskets in a firing line. The next part would be the hard part. They had discussed this a good while, and they knew their only chance at not being overrun was to ensure the door would only open halfway. Edward had jerry-rigged the keycard console, hoping against hope the vault door would not fully open. They each took a final drink of water and positioned themselves. Joshua gave Edward the signal, and Edward stepped forward and ran the card through the slot. The door groaned and clanked and began to open. Edward joined Joshua back behind their barricade, their rifles now aimed at the slowly opening vault door. Already they could hear the ferals either awakening or noticing the door. A horrific chorus of screams filled the vault as the ferals began to scramble under the opening vault door. Joshua and Edward started to fire, collapsing the ferals before they could even get into the small inner vault. The rifles kicked and bucked and blew the ferals apart. The door had stopped halfway, and Edward smiled. Then, with a loud groan, the door continued to open.
Christ in heaven.
Edward sneered.
Jesus.
The door was nearly fully open, and Joshua and Edward fired the rifles over and over. The smell of cordite became acrid in that enclosed space. They didn't even stop to reload, dropping spent rifles and picking up loaded rifles and firing them again until they, too, were empty. Time and time again, they would kill a wave of ferals, and another wave would scramble into the small vault, cackling and hissing until the rifles blew their heads off. At one point, a pair of ferals were on Joshua as his rifle emptied, and he turned and shot them both in the face as they lunged at him with his pistol. Edward's eyes were wide, and his brow soaked with sweat as he fired round after round into the horde. He could see ferals climbing over their dead, their rotting legs slipping in the black blood and shell casings. He'd empty his rifle into those standing, and if he had time, he'd reload and shoot any that were quivering on the vault floor. Both men were breathing heavy and were soaked with sweat as they scanned targets and fired and fired and fired. And then, as fast as it had begun, it stopped. They were all dead. Edward was puffing hard as he reloaded one of the rifles and swept it over the mouth of the open inner vault.
Is that all of them?
Joshua spat dryly and wiped his brow.
I believe so.
The two men slowly exited the inner vault, watching the myriad of doorways that led into the atrium floor. Nothing moved. The inner vault they were holed up in was slick with blood, and a cloud of cordite hung heavy in the air. They began to relax, and Edward managed a strained smile.
Easy.
Joshua laughed. After their nerves had settled, they got to work stacking the rifles and ammo boxes in the center of the vault's atrium. They cleaned everything down as best they could, making sure to leave any of the faulty, jammed rifles behind. Edward took notes of everything in a small book he kept hidden in his robes. As if he was calculating something, Joshua retrieved the grenades he'd stashed in the back of the inner vault and closed the box up tight.
These we should leave with last. Who knows what condition they're in.
I agree, but let's not leave yet. There could be more here.
There could be more ferals, too.
Edward thought on this and shook his head.
No, they're all dead. We saw to that.
With that, Edward took up one of the rifles and his small pack and began walking further into the vault. All Joshua could do was sigh and follow. 30 minutes later, they had come to the overseer's office. The room was high in the back end of the vault, with a small oval window looking out into the atrium below. In the center of the room was a computer console, with a small ensuite and personal quarters nearby. Edward dropped his pack down and began to look around. Unlike the rest of the vault, this space wasn't in too bad a condition. It was as if the ferals had blockaded anyone ever coming too far into the vault and left this section basically untouched.
What could we possibly need here?
Edward drifted between the overseer's personal suite and the office itself.
What kind of man worked here? Ran this place?
Joshua studied the office again. Paneled walls, no art. Despite everything being coated with dust, it felt sterile and devoid of humanity.
A bureaucrat.
Edward smiled. He fired up the ancient computer console, which sluggishly came to life under the dim current of the emergency power. He began to pound away at the keyboard.
A bureaucrat who wanted to hide something.
Edward hit a series of keys, and a doorway began to open beneath the desk. Joshua drew his pistol and watched as a stairway descended below them. He didn't have a moment to protest before Edward had stepped down into the gloom. Beneath the overseer's office was a small lab. Harsh fluorescent light flooded the space, and the men squinted as their eyes adjusted. At the far end of the lab were the remains of something in a cage. For all intents and purposes, it was a red, rotting corpse. Joshua and Edward stared at the red thing. Its teeth were fanged and crusted with ancient black blood.
A ghoul?
Edward shrugged.
A mutant of some sort. This thing sent the ferals here crazy. Well, crazier.
Radiation did this?
Radiation. And something else.
Edward looked up at the vials and canisters that filled a shelf over where the corpse of the mutant was caged. He looked back over at Joshua.
This is the old world. Old world crimes against man and nature. It has to end here. Do you understand?
Joshua nodded.
I do.
Edward cast his eyes around the lab.
All this knowledge, and for what? Men living and dying in cages like animals. No future, no hope.
Joshua was listening to Edward, but he couldn't keep his eyes off the thing in the cage. He could see a network of ducts that must have passed gas into the cage. He shook his head.
These places weren't refuges. They were tombs.
They climbed out of the lab and were about to leave when Edward stopped Joshua. He disappeared for a moment into the overseer's private quarters and returned placing something into his pack.
What did you find?
You'll see when we're back at the village.
Edward grinned. As they left, Edward closed up the secret lab under the overseer's desk. Joshua then smashed the console. If there was another way into that lab, it was lost now. They passed back through the atrium, each taking the end of a box of rifles. It wasn't long until they were back in the security area, back with where Hatchet laid in the booth, his wide dark eyes and smile greeting them.
I heard the ruckus. Figured you boys either got it done or you got dead. Glad it was the former.
They laid the box down, and Joshua stepped forward. Joshua smiled.
It was close.
I don't doubt it. There was a lot of them, wasn't there?
More than you let on.
Hatchet smiled and shrugged.
It's a big vault. Get a good look at them. That nasty red skin.
Something was wrong with them. A chemical, an experiment. Made them worse.
Now Hatchet was nodding.
Figures. Thought this place was more than just a National Guard vault.
Hatchet took in a long, deep breath.
You ready to make good on your word?
Joshua drew his pistol.
I am.
Joshua pointed the pistol at Hatchet's head. He spoke so only he and Hatchet could hear.
I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith.
The shot was loud in that empty and lonely place. They weren't surprised no one greeted them as they left the vault. The Blackfoot thought them as good as dead the moment they entered. It took them a day to make it back to the Blackfoot village. What water they had was gone by the time they arrived, and even carrying the one box of rifles was enough to exhaust them. Nonetheless, Edward was beaming as they saw the village come into view, and the Blackfoot warriors laughed and hollering as they neared. Joshua and Edward had spoken at length at what would come next. It didn't take long for the majority of the village to greet them, led by the chieftain in his ornate and ridiculous mask. Joshua and Edward laid the box of rifles down, panting from the heat.
Here, what I promised.
Edward pointed back behind them.
There's more back there, more than you'll ever need.
Edward nodded at Joshua, and he translated to the chieftain. The villagers watched the conversation, and something like electricity moved through them. Edward and Joshua were exhausted, but they were also exhilarated. Joshua's voice was clear and strong as he explained what they had achieved. Edward watched the Blackfoot as they stared at the box of weapons and then back to Joshua. They looked afraid, but they also looked intrigued. The chieftain responded to Joshua for a while, and then Joshua turned back to him.
He says he accepts our gift and that we are free to go.
Edward smiled.
Is that all?
Joshua nodded. Edward knelt before the chieftain. As he did so, he gently placed his hand inside the pack he had carried all the way back to the village.
Tell him, I have one last gift.
Joshua translated. The chieftain moved closer and extended his hand, laughing that wet laugh under his mask.
The other day when you said you'd take our eyes if we returned here empty-handed, I said something to you, but you may not have heard me.
Joshua eyed the warriors either side of the chieftain and translated, standing tall, his hands by his side.
Do you know what I said to you?
The chieftain leaned in close, listening to Joshua translate.
I said I was going to kill you and take everything.
In a flash, Edward had the power fist out of the pack, and he hit the chieftain so hard in the face, the mask split open and blood splattered into the dust. Joshua stepped back and shot each warrior either side of the chieftain dead, and then madly began speaking in Blackfoot. The villagers and remaining warriors were shocked. The chieftain was spitting blood and teeth, his mask shattered. He was crawling on all fours as Edward stood over him. Edward primed the power fist and smiled.
I'll make your people mine. I'll do everything you failed to do. No one will even know your name. but they will remember mine for eternity.
Edward brought the power fist onto the chieftain's head. There was a horrific squish as his skull cracked. In the background, Joshua was explaining the new way of things to the Blackfoot. They watched on in horror, but they understood. Their chieftain was weak, and Edward was strong. As they came to understand, the villagers began to kneel. Women, children, and warriors alike knelt before Joshua and Edward as their chieftain lay dying. The chieftain was now coughing blood through the mask, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild. Edward raised the power fist one last time.
I am the son of Mars, and you are nothing!
Edward brought the fist down into the chieftain's head, crushing it.